Hey, there you go.
Thanks.
The moment came, and I pushed the button, and it all happened.
Yes.
Calling Chris Anderson. Are you still in Windsor? You haven't moved yet, right?
I haven't moved yet. No. I'm going to be here. I go to Bulgaria in 2 weeks, but until then, I'm here.
Fantastic. I am still locked in my stateroom aboard the Crystal Serenity, and we're docked in Newport. I'm here until Friday. I gave a talk a couple of days ago on the Ghost Army. I'm giving one tomorrow about the battle between Lexington and Concord for Revolutionary War bragging rights.
Switching it up, yeah. Look at that.
Yeah. I have to do other things aside from the Ghost Army. So,
can you wait? Could you say that again?
No, I can't. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, could be you're watching on replay, could be you're listening to the HHH podcast. We're glad you're here today. We'll be looking at 1,000 years of Native American history in the United States, which I didn't do the math, but what is that like? 20 years a minute. So we're going to have to really move through it. Yeah. We want to take a moment to thank our Patreon supporters, especially our Top Shelf supporters. And you can become one by going to patreon.com/historyhappyhour. Nobody's become a Top Shelf supporter in the last few weeks. We had one person. So, but it's get out there and become a Top Shelf supporter. We really appreciate the assistance. Christopher, do we have any people viewing? And can you tell me about it?
We do, yes. Doreen Schultz is joining us again, and Harold Boltz from Hershey, Barry Milgate from Stafford in the UK, Ken from Kansas, David from
Jim Stark showed up an hour early and said, anybody here today? But then he came back and said, oops, I forgot about daylight savings time.
So I just wanted to save the spot in mine.
Yeah, but Jim, you do get the record there for first comment by an hour. So hold on to that. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, Chris, I think I've killed enough time. Can you get us started?
Yes. The bar is open.
The bar's open, Chris. So what is on tap today?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this week's book because it's a little bit different than what we normally do, and it's fascinating. And what we're going to be talking about is Native Nations, a Millennium in North America by Kathleen DuVal, a book that Claudio Sant has called a feat of both scholarship and storytelling. And for those of you who would like to know, Kathleen is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she teaches early American and American Indian history. Her previous works include Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, which was a finalist for the George Washington Prize, and some others as well. So
Kathleen, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate it.
Delighted. Did you bring a cocktail today to share with us?
I brought not a cocktail, but a beer. It is a brown ale, chestnut brown ale that's brewed by Seven Clans Brewing, which is a Cherokee-owned brewery.
Oh, nice, awesome. And Chris, did you come with a cocktail?
I did. I got the usual Glenturret.
I'm drinking very clear wine today. So.
Rick. And I just, again, as we pointed out, Rick is on a cruise where it's an open bar, but
the alcohol is free, and that's why I'm, I'm having a dry hour.
Okay. Good. So if he hits the wrong button. All right. So let's get started. I'm going to steal a quote here from the book to get started. He says, when we flip the story of colonialism from European to Native perspectives, we see the long history of North America as it actually was, not as the Europeans wished it to be, and perhaps what it might have continued to be. So where do we get it wrong, and why did you decide to maybe retell the story?
Yeah, well, I think what we tend to do is collapse several hundred years, maybe even a millennium of history into a very short story of that says basically Europeans got to the Americas and very quickly overrode native peoples, and the rest of the story, the rest of American history is theirs, right? Is Europeans and their descendants, and the world that they created. And what I wanted to do in this book is really slow that down and start before Europeans and Africans and Asians get to the Americas, and talk about a couple of centuries of Native American history and Native change before that, and then walk, somewhat slowly, as much as one can in one book, through the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, and even into the 1800s, because those are periods in which Europeans didn't immediately sort of take control over the whole continent. It takes centuries for that to happen. And so the book tells lots of those stories, lots of histories that happen in those centuries. And then also goes all the way to the present and shows how Native nations survived even the worst times for them, the times when Europeans, and particularly the United States, actually did have a great deal of power over them, and in some decades really sort of tried to destroy them as nations.
Right. Okay.
So one thing you do, especially in the opening chapters, is compare the technology, culture, governance of Native American nations with European nations of the same period. I guess to make the point that their history is part of world history. It's not this thing that's happening all off by itself.
Mhm.
Why was that important to you?
Well, I think another one of those things that we tend to get wrong is comparing how Native people lived 1,000 years ago with the way Europeans and Americans live today, and sort of describing Native Americans as being primitive, as never having sort of achieved the kind of civilization that Europeans did. And so that's why I wanted to start 1,000 years ago, when, if you looked around the globe, really what's going on in North America is quite similar to the way Western Europe and many other places around the world would have looked. That they're civilizations that have developed not only agriculture, but large-scale agriculture. There are cities in both places, cities of tens of thousands of people. There are trade networks that span large distances. As you said, that North America, the Americas are part of world history, even though there isn't trade going on and exchange going on between the Americas and the rest of the world. And 1,000 years ago, on the sort of most macro level, the development that's going on in agriculture and trade and economics and politics are not that different from each other, in technology, not that different from each other, and very different in all of those places, including Western Europe, from today.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of, I guess, the questions I'm going to have will make me sound kind of foolish, because, as you point out in the books, as Westerners, I guess we make these assumptions about the people that lived here. And, right from the start, you talk about, for example, Cahokia, which is a city that rivals London, right, in terms of scale, which is kind of startling. So maybe we could talk a bit about that. But then also the fact that these people make a conscious decision to pursue a different course, and that I thought was just amazing. So please kind of elaborate on that.
Great. So 900 years or so ago, if you went to Cahokia, which is across the Mississippi River from where St. Louis is today, so basically right in the middle of the continent of North America, there was a grand city there, as you say, very similar in scale and sort of complexity to a place like London and many other cities in Western Europe and around the world at the time. It had quite powerful, it seems from the archaeology and from the oral history, quite powerful leaders who had both political and religious power. And you could find, Cahokia was one of the largest, but you could find other cities, civilizations like that all across North America, or at least the sort of big corn growing areas of North America, because they're all dependent on large scale agriculture. And then in about the 1100, late 1100s, the 1200s, things started to change. And what archaeologists say is they can see the change on the land. They can see that people moved out of these great cities and spread out across the river valleys of North America. So really a huge change in economics and in sort of lifestyle and the way people lived. And then if you look at oral history helps us to explain why people did this, which is one of the things that it's sort of hard for archaeology to tell us. And all across North America, oral histories of very different peoples, very different kinds of people, different language groups and culture groups. They talk about this era of many, many hundreds of years ago when the people decided to live a different way. And they say different reasons why. Certainly one of the reasons had to do with the climate. The large cities of both Western Europe and North America, our part of North America, north of central Mexico, were created in an era that climate scientists call the medieval warm period. So a time when it was relatively easier to grow large amounts of corn and other crops, and warmer climate, more predictable weather than there was before or after that period. And so in the period in the late 1100s and the 1200s especially, the climate change. The climate changes all around the world. And the globe sort of slowly moves into the Little Ice Age, which, as its name implies, is colder, not as great for farming, especially in these sorts of bands of latitude. And so what seems to have happened, what seems to be clear from both the archaeology and oral history is that it became harder for people to live on these large scales of civilization. And people either, in some cases, rose up against powerful leaders who had proved unable to feed the people, or in some cases just left. In Cahokia, it seems mostly they just started leaving and sort of left their
housing prices were through the roof. They said, "Yeah, we're going to suburbs." Yeah,
exactly. We're just done with this, and then spread out and built smaller towns. And economies that were more diversified. So say their ancestors in these cities had mostly lived on agriculture, mostly on corn and other crops. They began to actually hunt more, to gather more. So to have farms, but also have places in the woods where they had sort of cultivated berries and things like that they knew they could return to year after year in the right season to collect. And also they cultivated more intensive trading relationships with their allies. And so all of these things seem to be about preventing the kind of probably famine that happened when the Little Ice Age hit. Civilizations that were very, very dependent on large-scale agriculture. Europeans come and then see these economies that have some farming, but also have some hunting and have some gathering, and that's where Europeans get the idea that Native Americans are primitive and have always been primitive. They don't see these as sort of complex economies that were created in response to difficulties feeding the people. They just say, they're like primitive people. They never had cities. They never had large-scale agriculture.
But it was a deliberate decision rather than.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And it really seems very true across different oral histories that there was some deliberateness. And now it's easy that is a sort of the way I describe it makes it sound sort of almost pleasant to like change your life. But of course it must have been hugely traumatic to have famine and either revolt or have to find a new homeland. It was a very difficult time. But the choices were purposeful in response to trouble.
Yeah.
So I imagine that when you're looking into this kind of time, that this is one of the places where you've kind of faced the challenge that there aren't the sort of written documents that you would have if you're looking at European cities or Asian cities. So because people didn't have, to my knowledge, most of these natives or all of them didn't have a written language. So I guess I would ask, first of all, you've talked about kind of what you relied on, which is archaeology, and oral history. Talk about those a little bit, but also about kind of what holes do you wish you could fill? If you could dig up those very hidden, native records that they didn't want anybody to know about.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the archaeology has there's been a lot of it, and there's a huge amount of information that comes from it, but it's also ongoing, and some of it is in places where a lot of people live. So it may be that lots more information comes from archaeology in the coming decades that will, even change the way we think about things. But archaeology can tell us the kinds of things like where do people live? So for example, archaeology in the Southwest has seen this sort of change from kind of a small scale city becoming a larger scale city where more and more people live, irrigation projects, especially in the Southwest, getting more and more complex, clearly feeding a large number of people off of the same irrigation project. And then at least for some of the sites, in the period where the climate starts to change and clearly there's some famine, it's harder to feed people. In some places, they've found more and more building of walls, like the elite clearly walling themselves off from the sort of the hungrier people. So you can sort of interpret from that increased inequality, increased opposition then to the rulers, and then archaeology can see when nobody lives in a place anymore, or the huge numbers that used to live there aren't there anymore. So we definitely see this pattern of more and more centralization and urbanization, and then decline in these centralized places. And then oral history, and I didn't really expect this when I was starting this research. I mean, oral history is not really designed to help historians like me, right? It's supposed to tell a people about who they are and where they come from, much more than about sort of the kinds of specific things that a historian like me wants to see. But for a huge number of Native peoples of North America, part of their creation story, part of the big messages about who they are, actually are centered in this period of centuries ago, because it was such a big deal to change the way they lived and to develop these, as I said, new economies and new sort of smaller scale ways of living. But also, what I didn't mention is a new kind of politics. So in many, many Native American societies, there is a sort of a value placed on making sure that that really powerful leaders don't rise to the fore and overtake democracy. And so part of oral history, and particularly the sort of almost creation stories, and in some cases actually creation stories, talk about this time period when they were ruled by people who became too powerful and stopped having the good of the people in mind, and that there was a period where the people had to either flee and find a new place to live, or rise up and take their leader down and find a different way to live and a new place to live. And so it's so obviously about this era and so common across North America that it really mapped amazingly well, really surprisingly well, I thought, onto the archaeology. So I think those for this area, the book obviously goes on through many more centuries where there are written documents. But for this era, it was mostly archaeology and oral history.
I want to jump forward to the 17th century as we're starting to encounter some of the Europeans. But before I do, we had a question from one of our viewers, Wally Morrison, and he would like to know: did these Mesoamericans have things like courts, government, prison, jails, like a structure?
Right. Yeah. So they definitely had government, and we don't know that much about whether they had sort of law courts as we would imagine them. And definitely we don't know if they had prisons and jails. They clearly had like tribunals, sort of like tribunals, like ways that things were adjudicated. And there were definitely powerful people that we would think of as judges, who were part of the elite in most of these places, who would judge sort of disputes. And in part, one of the things that oral history says they wanted to change was to not have the elite or the very powerful leaders always making the decisions, and they built in more democratic ways of deciding things and balancing. So having, say, a war chief and a peace chief who would sort of balance each other out in deciding sort of disputes or major decisions.
Can I throw in
Yeah,
another
go,
question
go.
from a
Please.
viewer? Lynn Hargrove wants to know, were the inhabitants part of a tribe we would recognize today? And this is kind of touches on a big theme in your book, so I'll just let you address that question.
Yeah, I'm really glad Lynn asked that, because yes, absolutely yes. So one of the themes of the book, as you say, is to connect this distant past with the people today. So one of the things that not all that long ago archaeologists would say is and certainly in the 19th century, many 19th century Americans would say, we know there's this ancient sort of this kind of ancient civilization. We can see the ruins of it in a place like Chaco Canyon. Clearly there was an advanced civilization here. But then they would say, but this advanced civilization has nothing to do with today's Native Americans. And this is the sort of myth of them being primitive. Right? They couldn't possibly have built these old civilizations. Maybe they killed off the people of the old civilizations or something like that. But they didn't, definitely. So in my book, I particularly look at descendants of Cahokia are sort of, Cahokia was sort of evangelical, and so all across the Southeast and even west of the Mississippi, there were large-scale civilizations, mostly not quite as large as Cahokia, but that modeled themselves on Cahokia. And the descendants of those, archaeologists call these the Mississippian civilizations, because they're all across the Mississippi and its tributaries, west and east. Descendants of the Mississippians include Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and many other peoples of the east, and also Osage and Quapaws and other peoples just west of the Mississippi. So lots and lots of descendants of the Mississippian peoples. And in the Southwest, the people of the Pueblos, the various Otham groups in what's now Arizona and the Mexican state of Sonora, they're all descended from various Southwestern grand civilizations. And then there were also ones in the Ohio Valley, sort of on a slightly different time scale, and sort of Shawnees and many other peoples are descended from them.
So Kathleen, one of the areas as we were marching through 1,000 years of history that I found really fascinating was the 17th century, as the Europeans were starting to encounter the native people. Because I grew up in Plymouth County, and I had pilgrims up to the eyeballs, and there's definitely a story of, the pilgrims came, we had this thing called Thanksgiving, and then we were terrible to the Indians, and then they just all went away.
Right.
And obviously that's not the case. And we could talk about just this section of the book for an hour, but there's some wonderful moments. You say, speaking of Roanoke, but it would apply all along the coast there. Far from the stereotypes of native savages, the people who welcomed the English to Roanoke were savvy diplomats. They recognized that these visitors could be economically and militarily useful. That they were agents in this engagement. They weren't just waiting to get run over. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that's, that really surprises people sometimes. And it's because we're looking through, back through the telescope toward the past. And we see, like one of the things we might say is, don't welcome those Europeans. Things are not going to go very well. Right. So it might be a little bit of hindsight. But it also doesn't, in most places, it doesn't happen right away. And in most places, at least initially, the Europeans, they come in small numbers. They know they have to bring goods to trade because they want things out of the local native people. And so local native people sort of put them to use, right? Incorporate them into their trading networks, sometimes draw them into a war that's already existing between them and other people. That certainly happens in New England. And I don't want to, so mentioning New England, New England is one of those places where Europeans then do come in pretty large numbers relatively early. So things really change fast for all the native groups who live near the New England settlements in the 1600s. But at the same time, they're still there today. Their descendants live there, and they're still polities. They're still nations within the umbrella of the United States today. So, in some ways, it's even one of the things I do in the book is I compare people like nations like the Kiowas. So the Kiowas are people of the Southern Plains by the 19th century, and they really aren't affected by Europeans until the mid 1800s. So 200 years later than the Algonquian and other peoples around New England really feel the brunt of colonialism because of those large numbers of English people who come there early.
But I mean, I think, you talk a lot about how really it's the native people initially, they're kind of calling the shots, right? And I mean, I one of the stories I loved in the book was you talked about, I can't remember which tribe it was, but they basically sell the French lots of fool's gold, which the French don't take. Like, because you always hear about, the Indians selling Manhattan for whatever, right? But who was really doing the, that was a really kind of a fascinating.
Yeah, exactly right. And I talk about the selling Manhattan, and people say the Lenape sold it for beads, and beads were incredibly important in symbolizing a relationship. So they granted the Dutch the use of a part of Manhattan Island in return for a relationship that was symbolized by beads, but wasn't the beads themselves, a relationship of trade and military alliance. So.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things, so your book tries to flip the perspective, right? So usually we're reading about, let's say it's the Pilgrims, or let's say it's the settlers in Jamestown. So we're reading all about the trials and travails of the settlers in Jamestown and their interaction with natives. But it's always from the point of view of the settlers. Mm-hmm. And you flip it around so that we're looking at all these tribes over hundreds of years that are interacting with each other, sometimes at war with each other, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But and then sometimes there's a little bit of interaction with the Europeans. Right. And so suddenly it sort of changes the center of gravity of the story. Right. And you realize there's a whole different lens that you can look through.
Yeah. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
I don't have a question that's on top of that. Right. But talk about that a little bit. I mean,
I think that's exactly right. That's exactly my point here, and to tell these different perspectives from different Native nations perspectives. And when I was, my research, I did a lot of research in primary source documents, but I also did a lot of research in sort of talking to historians within the tribes today that I was focusing on, and also just going to their museums and cultural centers and seeing how they present their history. And it really struck me. I went to the Tohono O'odham Cultural Center and Museum in, it's in what's now Arizona. And they have this timeline on the wall, and it a very brief sort of what happens in different time periods. And it has the sort of 1600s and 1700s, they say, and 16, 17, and 18. So 3 centuries of history, they say. Spaniards and Mexicans and some people from the United States arrive. They don't have much effect. That's not the way that historians have told that history from the perspectives of Spain and Mexico and the United States in those eras. And so, to them, other things were going on that were more important. And it's only so for them, for example, when the United States comes in large numbers, when settlers start to come, when they cut off their water, like they dam parts of their rivers and keep them from farming, that the United States becomes a big part of their history, because it's sort of, it is bringing terrible change.
Well, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to, can I do a follow-up? No.
Well, I just said go ahead. Yeah.
Well, okay. So following up on this sort of flipping of the script, you talk about Roanoke, and I was quite fascinated with the Roanoke story, because we've all heard about the people come and they have a colony, and the ships go away and they wave goodbye, and they come back 3 years later and they're gone. And this is the story of the lost colony. But you paint a whole story that there's this whole story of interaction between the British and the natives that goes on well before the lost colony.
Right.
It includes violence. It includes 2 Native Americans, Menteo and Wanchese.
Yeah.
Who are taken to England and then taken back again.
Right.
And suddenly it just kind of, it just sort of kind of blows your mind about what's going on. I never even kind of thought of it in those terms before.
Right. Yeah. As you say, at some point the English. So in one of there are three sort of settlement attempts. I count them differently. If you count those like the ones that are such a failure, they almost don't even happen at all. But there's three settlement-ish attempts, and at the end of one of them, the English kill the leader of the local Algonquian tribe there, and then flee. They have to get out on the first ship that comes by. They all they actually accidentally leave a couple guys behind, but basically they all get on the ships and say, "You have to take us out of here. We are all going to get killed." And then the lost colony ends up sort of ignorantly landing itself right in the same place. So it's
awkward.
Yeah, awkward, right? That history matters for how the people
how you
there
get treated.
with these new English people. So, awkward.
So, speaking of perspective and flipping perspectives, you do mention this, and again, I don't think that's something that not a lot of people are aware of, but there were native peoples that went to England, and they went at the behest of their chiefs as diplomats, right?
Right.
They had observations about what they saw. What did they think of these incredibly advanced, civilized people who were all that in a bag of chips?
Yeah, right. So in some ways we have to imagine hypothesize what they thought, because they generally didn't tell the Europeans what they thought, right? Because they're reporting back to their people about them, and they didn't leave written records for us to see, and it hasn't really that kind of specifics haven't really survived in oral history. But what we see is some places they come back and almost immediately the locals try to kill off, and in some cases do kill off all the Europeans. So clearly they've come back and said something like,
not impressed.
And we thought they were, right? It doesn't take much imagination to figure out what they said. Now, one of the things we know about Manio and Wantes, who went to London, we know what London looked like, and we know what the society that they came from looked like. And so it's very, you have to imagine what we don't know what they thought, but we know what they saw. They would have gone to London Bridge, to bridges across the Thames, and seen beheaded people's heads lining the bridge. That is not something that their societies did to people. Right. And what exactly they said to their own people when they came back from a place like that. Also a place where they'd seen poverty. London at the time is grossly overcrowded. It's the population has rebounded from the plague, and it's bigger than fits in London, and they must have gone back and described some of these things, just simply because they're so different from the society that they had come from, where there weren't the extreme, partly because of this long ago history we were talking about earlier in the episode, didn't have extremes of wealth and poverty, where like the value was on like leaders were respected if they made sure everyone had enough to eat, right, and had a good place to live. And so they must have come back and talked about those things. That this is a big and powerful and very populated society. All those things might not have seemed clear from the few English guys who showed up on their shores, but they must also have commented on the way of life that was so different from theirs.
You can have another one, Chris.
I
did too, so I don't want
to. Well, I don't want to get too hung up on the 17th century, because I said I found that section just brilliant, because there were so many things that kind of really cause you to think a little bit differently. But moving forward through time, there's this little thing that Rick and I disagree on the title of. Here we call it the War of Independence, but Rick calls it the Revolution.
American Revolution.
Yeah, that thing. And maybe you're celebrating the 250th anniversary of this event. Maybe you could talk about.
Oh, you're celebrating, because we're not British like you are. All right.
Well, the American Revolution,
it does seem like a kind of an inflection point. That period of the Revolution and the 7 Years' War before it. That seems like a big turning point in the power of the natives coming down, and the power of the United States pushing pushing on.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And so I split the book in 1750, sort of letting the first half be really almost completely native power, and only some of which has any Europeans in it, right? This first couple of chapters don't have any Europeans. And then the American Revolution, the War of Independence, whatever you want to call it. It's not that the day that it's over, it changes everything for Native nations, but it is something we can look back at and say that really by creating the United States, it changes things, and it's going to change the balance of power on the continent in a way that European colonization had not done, despite the fact that it had been around for a couple of centuries. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the United States doubles its population every generation in the years between pretty early 1700s and pretty late 1800s. So for a good 100 and probably quite a bit more years, the United States is doubling in population. And it's part of that is immigration, but a huge part of it is just natural increase. People having more babies and babies living to adulthood to have more babies, right? And that combines with the fact that the United States is built on an idea that to be a republic, you need citizens, men who own their own farms, so they don't have a boss or a landlord telling them what to do. And so there's an assumption built right into, it's a bit into English colonialism, but it's certainly right at the heart of the meaning of the United States, which is that citizens should have their own farms, that is the best way to be a citizen. And therefore, combined with this doubling population, that the United States is going to need to get bigger and bigger in geography. And that will have a huge impact on peoples like the Shawnees and Cherokees and Choctaws and Chickasaws who live just west of the Appalachian Mountains. And then eventually in the 19th century, second half of the 19th century, even far west and on the plains and in the Southwest.
So I want to remind everybody that we are chatting with Kathleen DuVal, who is the author of Native Nations, Millennium in North America. And we're zooming through 1,000 years, and there's a number of years we've skipped, but
read the book. You'll read it.
Some of them you just have to read the book to find out about those years. The early 1800s sees Shawnee chief Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa trying to bring Native nations together to jointly war on the United States, and really to kind of form a whole, trying to sort of bring them together. Like, let's not be a bunch of different nations. Let's be one nation and one culture and go to war with the United States. And you write, Native nations exist today in part because their ancestors rejected both the U.S. civilization policy and efforts like those of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, I'm sure I'm saying his name wrong, to persuade them to identify and act as a unified race. So what are the choices that the natives have here, and how are they responding to them? Because I thought this was another kind of inflection point.
Yeah, so in the early decades of the United States, there is basically an offer from the United States. And, we can debate about how genuine it is, how realistic it was from the U.S. perspective. But there's an offer to Native Americans that if you will live differently, you can become U.S. citizens. You can, as long you have to not be members of tribes anymore. Like your tribes aren't compatible with being Americans. But if you'll do that, basically not be Native Americans anymore, there isn't sort of a racialized view that they can't become like white Americans. Like, I think that later there is, right? Later in the late 19th century and early 20th century, but in the late 1700s and early 1800s, there is at least a promise from people like Jefferson and Washington that if you, and many, many missionaries, that if you become Christian, if you sort of change the way you live on the land, you can become citizens. And so that's one choice, and whether it's completely real or not, it is one choice. And then the other is one that Tecumseh and his brother put, and many, quite a lot of other Native prophets and war leaders over the decades between the sort of mid 1700s through the mid 1800s. And they say, we have to band together. And what Tecumseh says, what Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa and others say, is not only band together as a military alliance, which is something that many have tried before that and would continue to try, but we have to. It's a religious movement as well, and basically, the religious movement is one of separate creations. They say God created Europeans, God created Africans, and God created Native Americans. God put Europeans in Europe and Africans in Africa and Native Americans in the Americas. And God meant them to stay separate. And the Europeans messed it all up. The Europeans came to our place. They stole people from Africa and brought them to our place. What God wants is that reversed. God wants all Native Americans to recognize that they're the same, which is, wildly different from their actual history, which is very, different from each other. And language, culture, and sort of warfare, fighting against each other. But really, Tecumseh says, we're all the same kind of people, and we need to kick out all Europeans and Africans. And there are definitely Native Americans in the early 1800s who follow that message and fight on his side, fight on their side. But for most Native Americans, it doesn't ring true. Most of them, some of them, certainly most Shawnees by this period, which is Tecumseh's people, they think the United States is the greatest enemy, and they think that they're the greatest threat to the Shawnees, and it's time to make peace with old Native enemies, and sort of find a way to militarily ally with them. But they don't want to stop being Shawnees. And also they don't want to do some of the other things that Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa say, like not using any European products. These are, like, say, for example, Shawnee farmers, or they're women who have used metal hoes for generations, right? They don't want to go back to using a stone hoe or other things that Tecumseh says they should do. And so it's sort of it's an unrealistic choice, I think, for most Native nations, that basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like, in order to drive off Europeans and drive off the United States and retain your land, you should give up everything that makes your people your people. And most say that, well, that's a false choice. We're gonna stay being Shawnees or stay being Potawatomis. We're not gonna we're not going to go down this road. And so that's why I argue that, as much as we might sort of look back and say, whoa, they really should have all banded together and fought against the United States together, we can see that maybe in the long run, what allowed Native nations today to survive and for there today be almost 600 federally recognized tribes in the United States, not even counting state recognized tribes in Canada and Mexico. What allowed them to survive as separate nations was actually saying no to both, saying no to the sort of European or U.S. sort of pressure to give up their native nations, and saying no to prophets and war leaders who wanted native prophets and war leaders who wanted them also to sort of combine and give up their separate nationhood.
So, but that decision then to not resist in the way, in a large scale, kind of following on from that, becomes this period of removals.
Yeah.
And so maybe one of the things, again, that I found very startling was just the scale of it. Right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about just what a mass movement of people this is, and how they're reacting to this, because they must see this coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes and no. At first, there is sort of Andrew Jackson and various states, especially Georgia, start putting pressure on the Cherokees and other tribes to, basically pick up and leave their country completely. And I think on the one hand, they see all this pressure, but on the other hand, it's just unimaginable. It's not actually the way things usually go, right? If you lose a war, or you lose some land, or you lose power, usually your nation isn't entirely forced to pick up and be marched to a completely different place that isn't yours and has other people living there already anyway. Yeah, it's on a massive scale, and it isn't, the most famous ones are the Cherokees and other southeastern peoples, but it's actually, I have a map in the book that shows that people are coming from
All over,
right, all over the continent, and are being forced from the United States forces Native communities, Native nations from all over the continent to move into what's now Oklahoma and the states right around Oklahoma. And it's a massive people, the historians these days, and Native Americans these days sort of debate what to call it. Almost Indian removal is almost too gentle, right? Right, ethnic cleansing, or, mass deportations.
Yeah.
You write that the period from the end of the Civil War to the early 20th century was a very, very dark time for Native tribes. I mean, they're put on reservations, the removal, they lose land, their children are put in boarding schools where and people are trying to essentially extirpate these tribes, these nations. But many tribes survive.
Yeah.
As you say, 600. Many of them, I mean, yes, there's a lot of problems, but many of them survive and are in pretty good shape today. So so how does that happen? I mean, how do they manage that? How does that survivance, occur?
Right. Yeah. So first of all, what I was surprised is a lot of tribal historians told me we sort of think of Indian removal, but that wasn't the hardest time. That after Indian removal, their nations were able to regroup. They had a new homeland, as hard as that was, and as many people who died as part of that process. They could rebuild their nations, and then they get hit again, as you say, in the late 19th and early 20th century by a much stronger U.S. government. You think by that period, the U.S. government is much stronger. And then tries to make them end their nations, make them end their tribal governments, stop speaking native languages, split up their communal land holdings, and send their children off to boarding school to be far away from their parents and grandparents, not speaking their language. And so I think that, the answer to that question of how on earth did they survive this period of the most horror and the most sort of purposeful attempts to destroy them as nations was that they just kept telling their children who they were. And so there are these stories of kids who go off, they're forced off to boarding school. But then they say, in the summer when we came home, we spent the whole summer with grandma, and she spoke to us in our language, and she kept telling us over and over, we're Shawnee, or we're, wherever, whatever we are, and don't let them take that away from you. And then they go back to boarding school. And in some of the boarding school, the early boarding schools, that was the place where Native activism really was born across different tribes. But so one of the sort of unintended consequences of and boarding schools are terrible. I don't want to make it sound like they're anything but terrible. But sometimes positive things can come out of terrible things. And so you have kids at a boarding school, say at someplace like Carlisle, that have come from all different places, entirely different language families, could never have talked to each other before. There's some activists who come out of the boarding schools in the early 20th century who say, I always thought of this other tribe as my eternal enemy, but I met these kids and they were just kids like me, and we talked about how our families and our histories had some things in common. And then out of the boarding schools and people, adults who had met as children in the boarding schools, came the first organizations like the Society of American Indians that started pressing for change at the federal level by combining activisms of multiple tribes by people. There are these sort of survivors, students of boarding schools who spoke great English and could write a beautiful paragraph and all these things that they'd actually managed to learn out of the terrible experience of boarding school. So I think, the simple answer, it's not the simple answer, but the most straightforward answer is just by not letting it happen, by just continuing to, as best they could, and sometimes in hidden ways, continue to be Shawnee or be Choctaw or whatever they were.
Yeah, and I kind of continuing on with that, I don't want to make it seem like things are great, because as you point out, they're not. But you also talk about we're in a period now where Native peoples are much more aware of their heritage, and it's gone beyond that. They're feeling their strength and they're exerting themselves.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about where we are in that evolution.
Yeah.
The fact that not only did they preserve their culture, but now they're doing something.
Yeah, right. So beginning in the 1930s, very slowly. But beginning with the New Deal, there was sort of the federal government basically reversed its policy and had some back and forth after that, but basically stops trying to destroy Native nations and begins very slowly, at least trying to recognize Native nations. And so in that period, in the second half of the 20th century and continuing through today, Native nations have been able to, in some cases, buy back some land. It's horrible. They've had to buy land that once belonged to them, right? But start to buy back some land, establish tribal businesses, casinos, and other types of businesses that then can bring in revenue. You can't really operate as a government, certainly as a modern government, unless you have sources of revenue. And then that for many, many tribes has created a sort of virtuous circle in which once you have a little revenue, you can put it into, say, small business loans for your tribal members, who then maybe, if their small business does well, can bring in a sort of a tax base to the nation. And you can use those revenues then to pay for a new cultural center or for language programs for your youth. And so an awful lot of tribes, of Native nations today are going through this and just sort of bringing back things, putting money into language revitalization, and then also I think there's a bigger sort of public presence of Native people today. You can see sort of Native actors in big films and TV shows, and cases in front of the Supreme Court, and in art museums. Many art museums have had recent contemporary Native art exhibits, right, making the point that Native artists, Native people are still around today. They aren't just people of the past. And so, this could all be reversed. Things don't always go up and up, but right now, at least, sort of Native leaders really think of this as a time of renaissance in arts and culture and language and governance as well. So if you look at things like the U.S. Infrastructure bill, tribal governments are included as part of the polities, the county and local governments and state governments that are part of that. We were talking about America 250 before. Tribal governments are included as some of the local and regional organizations that are part of commemorating the American Revolution.
One of the things, talking about the involvement of tribal governments, that one of the things that I was kind of shocked by was that there were tribes that acted independently to declare war on Germany in World War I and World War II. That they, okay, the United States is at war, but we're not bound by that, but we're going to be at war too. And
That's right.
I had never heard of that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so the Mohawks and other Haudenosaunee, other Iroquois declare war on Germany, and they'll say, you can't draft us, and they definitely couldn't be drafted in World War I because Native Americans were not officially citizens, were not universally citizens in World War I, but they were by World War II. But in both cases, at least some Native Americans said, you can't draft me. I can decide to serve, or the Mohawk Nation can send me to serve, and they can draft me. But yeah, but also
complicated.
This is the war we want to enter because we think Hitler should be defeated. Yeah.
So Kathleen, go ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
No, all right. Well, I was just going to say, one of the things I loved about your book is that it just causes you to look at your own history completely different. It just flips everything upside down, right? Good. Given how much time you've spent on this topic and it's your life's work, without getting too personal, how has this impacted how you view your country and your place in American history? And has it caused you to look at
that's a great question. I think certainly, maybe I'll start from the other end of that question. I wouldn't have been able to write this book or understand, I think, the things I do about this long history to the present if I hadn't been here at University of North Carolina. I've just learned a huge amount from Native staff and faculty and students here, just sort of teaching me. And I think maybe the main thing, teaching me the connections. Like, I think I started out as a historian in a pretty narrow time period and really just looking at what I was trained to do, and just over and over talking to Native Americans today, and especially Native historians today, said you got to connect it all. Like you can't tell it without the present. And so I don't know. I think I guess I would say what I really, maybe this is something that all historians think, but it is impressed on me how things can go really badly and things can start to go better as well. And as I think when I started on all this, 30 years ago, I thought I lived in a time period where there wasn't much change and there was sort of a stable period in history, and it feels a little different these days. And I think, as a historian, you look back and you say most of the time there isn't a lot of change. Most of the time people kind of end up in a world that's not that different from the one they were born in. But sometimes that's not true, and sometimes sudden dramatic change happens, and it can be for the better, or it can be the worse. And I think I'm maybe, by looking at all these time periods, I'm a little bit more of and maybe living through these days, I'm also a little bit more of a believer that sometimes really big things can happen, and they can definitely be horrible.
Yeah.
Well, on that happy note,
and sometimes they can be good.
Thank you.
Things can get better. And we're talking about both of those time periods, the time period of creating more democratic structures, many centuries ago, and the Renaissance today, I would point to as two time periods when people made things better.
There you go. So Kathleen DuVal is the author of Native Nations, a Millennium in North America. Definitely a worthwhile book to purchase and to read. And I know that, as I say, I didn't get all the way through it, but I'm going to keep working on it because I think there's a lot there that I'd like to take a look at. Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to say goodbye, but hang on, and we'll give you a proper goodbye.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you.
We finished the show. Okay. That was Kathleen DuVal. That was excellent.
Absolutely.
That was and very different. And so I think everybody we had a few questions we didn't get to, we apologize. But we had many questions in our list that we didn't get to as well. And there were at least 3 or 4 years in that 1,000 that we probably should have mentioned that we didn't. Yeah. So next week, Chris, we're going to welcome Rachel Lance, who is the author of Chamber Divers. And this is a book about the British scientists who conducted life-threatening experiments on themselves to help make D-Day possible. Now, that is one heck of a sentence with which to advertise the next week's show. It's a very unusual tale. It was one that was secret for a long time, but Rachel Lance has dug it up, and she's telling this story, and I think it's going to be a topic that's well worth our attention for Remembrance Day and Veterans Day.
Absolutely.
So coming up there. So that's what's coming up next week. Guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on X, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe and vote.
Yes, please.
Next week.
Vote. Bye-bye.